do you do this for you, or are you thinking altruistically for 100 years from now when we're all gone?
I'm actually kind of thinking more. Me personally, I'm thinking much more altruistically, and I think.
Tell me about that.
And I think, and there's a couple of reasons for that, because I got one email from a lady who had seen my article about the Gutter Griswold building, because they made electrical equipment, and she said my grandfather worked for them as one of their lead salesmen. Do you know anything about my grandfather? And I said, well, actually, it just so happens that I do. And so I sent her all of this information, and she was just, of course, like completely
out of her tree. Yeah, over the moon.
Over the moon. Because she had found out something about one of her ancestors that she didn't know before. And just recently, another gentleman contacted me about the work that I had done writing on the Masonic home down in Zenith, as it was called.
Right.
And he said, I know this is a long shot, but, my grandmother lived at the Masonic home, and that's where she passed away. Do you have any information on her? And so I put together all this information, and just, I used everything, it was all desktop, and I just pulled everything together and sent it to him. And he was just like completely over the moon. I mean, because most everyday people don't, for whatever reason, mostly it's time, right? They don't know where to turn. They don't know where to start. And they don't realize how this is a library card, right? This is what you get through a library card, a Seattle Public Library card. And especially at our point in the world right now, what you can get from a library card in Seattle is amazing, right? You get Seattle Daily Times, Seattle Post Intelligencer, Pacific Builder and Engineer. You get access to Ancestry. You don't get all the bells and whistles, but you get enough. You get enough to kind of get in the door. You have this incredible wealth of knowledge. You have the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps. Now, they're the black and white versions, but you can go and verify with the color versions in most cases. And if you and if it's a much more recent one, you can go to the library. They have all the bound magazines. You can go to the library, this is just the desktop stuff. And then you go to the library, and then you can just, do all of the research there and the directories. And the way that I look at it is that for whatever reason, these postcards, and this is where it kind of gets into the warm and fuzzy stuff, right? Because it's like someone sent that card, and they were very proud of it. Our Seattle home. And they sent it back to their relatives, or, I haven't actually figured out who sent that one. It's like it was the relatives. This one's great because the sender, no name on the sender, but the message is, do you think Margaret has grown? Margaret is in the photo. This is one of the ones that I just love. And it's, Dear Mrs. Opdyke, I want a cookie cake. The X is my room, much love, Alice. And this one, I had this card for a year, and I cracked it 2 days after the other one that I showed you. And I was just ecstatic because I was like, this is just so cool.
You're the postcard detective.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like this one, Wallingford. This house is no longer there. I had to ask for the real property record card, and I didn't have time. I didn't have time to go out to Bellevue. And so I said, "Can you scan it?" They're like, "Well, it'll be about 4 to 6 weeks." And I'm like, "5, that's fine." So I just put it on the back burner. But the thing that I find really fascinating, this is like Georgetown, no longer there. It's like a warehouse now. People used to live in these places. That's Queen Anne. That's University District. That's no longer there. That's just northeast of here. This is Ballard. This is East Madison, no longer there. No longer there. Fascinating story that one of his dogs, this owner's dogs, and I forget his name. He was a very prominent, wealthy individual. There was a dog poisoner in Capitol Hill in the early 1900s, and one of his dogs was poisoned by the dog poisoner. And the dog poisoner story, there was an article in one of I think it was either the New Yorker or the New York Times about the socialite, the highly placed socialite woman who was the dog poisoner. And I was like, oh, Seattle had a dog poisoner too. And supposedly it's a thing, which is horrible, but it's just one of those things. And the thing that I really love about that postcard is the fact that the dog that was poisoned, I think, is in that photo. So, so just like Marvin said, I really go down the rabbit hole in these things, but the way that I look at it is that, you know what, I consider myself blessed and fortunate enough to have time, and I like the fact if I can make one person happy, I'm good, right? So far I've made 2 people happy, so I consider myself very much ahead. But I just feel like, on a personal note, it's like not long after I moved to Seattle, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so the first 6 months that I lived in Seattle, like I was in chemo, right? I was undergoing chemo.
Through the Hutch?
Actually Swedish, actually. And so, needless to say, I did a lot of staring out of windows. A lot of staring downtown, like kind of going like staring at the Sorrento and all and just like the First Hill, the weirdness that is First Hill. Like First Hill is just one of the, architecturally, it's one of the weirdest neighborhoods that we have, and it's just so cool. And I don't think we appreciate it enough, and it's going away. Because, you've got, this is a prime example. This is the Hoffius house right around the corner from historic Seattle. And the Catholic Diocese wants to knock that down. I don't think they will prevail, but still, it's one of those things that
it's in jeopardy.
It's in jeopardy, and it's like this is an incredibly distinctive building, and just it's like this, but so the first 6 months that I was here, had a relatively large amount of kind of the worst kind of free time that you could possibly have. And then I was very fortunate enough, I was in remission for several years, and then came back in 2018, had a stem cell transplant at Swedish, and so that's number 2, and then I was in remission. And then last year I had another relapse, so I dealt with it for 3 times. And so obviously I'm around for some reason, and so it might as well be something positive that I hope that eventually brings people joy. And if my goal is to try to figure out a way, and you can see me kind of flailing around with it, is trying to figure out a way. And here, I'll share with you. I want to find out a way to share this, and it's like I feel like if Ancestry had a feature where you could do the ancestry of a building, and that people could link to it, and they could link their relatives and their ancestors, and I'm just, it's one of those things, like I feel like it's the most obvious thing in the world. Like, why is that not a thing? Because one of the gentlemen who contacted me, whose grandmother, had lived at the Masonic retirement home, I was like, well, this is where they lived in Ballard. And I was like, unfortunately, it's not there anymore, but this is where it is. And, that's like, there's a certain amount of closure to that. It's like like his family ended up living on a chicken ranch up in Snohomish County, up by Alderwood Manor. And he's like, I kept coming across Alderwood Manor, and I thought it was a retirement house, and I was like, no, it was a town. It was a wide spot on the inner urban. Let's just put it that way. And he was just like, I didn't know any of this. He's like, I was 15 when my grandparents passed away. I didn't think to ask any of this, you know. And so if I could somehow figure out a way to make this a bigger thing, because if I could scale it up, I would love for people to literally, there have to be knowledge experts that know where these places are. And it's like, I wish that I had been doing that. If I had known what I know now then, I wish that I had been doing this 25, 30 years ago, because it's like most of the people who knew what these things were before they ended up in a dealer's shop or on eBay, they knew where it was.
And they were alive.
And they were alive, and it was a place that had importance, you know. And so I think that the reason why I do it is that I think that, like, you know, for better or for worse, I think that my dad dealt with our family history, and we know our family history, and he wrote about it. He wrote a book about it. You know, so he wrote 2 books.
How in the hell do you have time?
I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. And those were not the only things he wrote. It's like he wrote numerous articles, and a black historian contacted one of our family friends and said that, you know, because my father had done a lot of research on black history in Mobile in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and unfortunately it's like a lot of his research revolved around lynchings, and a black historian contacted one of our family friends and said if it wasn't for my father, there are like 5 lynchings that we wouldn't have known about. And so there's a reason why we do things, and that's, as tragic as things sometimes are, and some of these stories are tragic. Like, I mean, you know, some of these things, you know, in some cases you come across in these images, you come across people who died the next year. You know, you come across people, you know, who, like, that was the only house they lived in, you know, or maybe their fortunes changed. So much changed in Seattle, and we talk about it still, but it, you know, it's like it's a constant. It's a real constant. But I mean, my hope is that somehow I can get this in a sense where people can come across it and they can link to, you know, because I think that, like, a national or international thing like Ancestry would be the only way to go about doing it. And they're close. You can sort of jury rig it, but it would be great if you could just...
It needs to be user-friendly.
It needs to be user-friendly. Yeah.
And you, I mean, the way you talk about this, and I find it hard to think that you even have a day job.
I do have a day, yeah, it's crazy.
But,
yeah.
And you like your day job.
Yeah.
But, I mean, when do you sleep? I mean, it's like, that's where you get into what's an obsession. But,
right.
I mean, have you thought about quitting your day job and starting a business of just this, you know?
It would be, you know, I've tried it before, right?
The postcard detective,
yeah,
or something like that. I mean, there would be ways to market it, but yeah, it'd be starting from scratch.
Yeah.
And who's the audience for this? Well, there probably are a fair number of people who care about their past.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people who don't.
No, and that's fine.
But speak to why this means something to them. You talked about it bringing closure,
right.
But closure to what? Is it just an innate thing in us all to know where we came from?
I think that might be part of it. I think that, you know, I think there's a certain frustration, you know, for us personally, you know, like researching our family, that we don't quite know exactly where we came from. Like we know where we were, you know, at a certain point in time, but we can't really trace it as far back. And
How does that make us happier, more satisfied in life?
I think that there's, and this might be a very American thing. It's like Americans are very nomadic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the themes that I keep seeing when I come across these images and I read the messages and I kind of learn more about these people, it's like, number one, they were very proud of being in Seattle. Seattle was, kind of the city of boundless opportunity, and was well reported, all across the country. Like when people came out here, it's like, oh, so-and-so went to Seattle, so-and-so, is, in the lumber industry in Seattle. And it's like everybody knows, they're doing great. So I think that, there's a certain sense of like where we came from, but also like just kind of a touchstone. Because, so many places that, for instance, like places that I've lived personally no longer exist. And I'm 45, and so that's something, I think it's like two places that I lived like no longer exist. Like one of the places that I lived in college.
You're reminding me of the joke. It's that I never knew that places I grew up in would have a formal jargon label. Mid-century modern.
Exactly. Exactly.
It was just our home.
Well, architectural historians didn't have a word. They didn't have a term for Art Deco until the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. And that's the amusing thing is to see journalists in the early 20th century stumble over themselves about what style some of these were, and that's one of the things that I'm really drawn to is how deeply, strangely weird some of these buildings are. Like they were really making it up as they went along. But back to what you were asking, I think that we, the United States is peopled by a lot of immigrants. It's like I'm very aware of the fact that there were indigenous people that were here. And I tread very carefully around that because I know that some people would get their hackles up about this as well. And it's like, well, you're just looking at white people's houses. And it's like, well, Seattle was a very white place. And I try to look past that. And I try to look at the stories and try to just, kind of demonstrate in a sense that history is not, history is ever evolving, ever changing. And somebody who produced these images, like they thought a certain way about them and they sent a certain message, and both literally and figuratively, because they were a status symbol. They showed the ultimate status symbol, and it's something that we still struggle with today. We struggle with housing. We struggle with housing inequity. We struggle with class, class and race, and like all of these things that we struggled with in the early 20th century. We still struggle with. We will continue to struggle with, and I'm just trying to identify the places before they like completely disappear from memory. Not literally in most cases. Like some of these, will be beloved houses for a long time.
But some of these, even the ones that are gone, the postcards could be in the trash heap too.
Yeah. And a lot of them did end up in the trash heap,
Right.
And basically, like if it's unidentified, it's not. It's of relatively limited use.
Mm-hmm.
There's some use, that you can get from it, but I've actually used some of these images to show construction techniques you know, to teach architectural historians. It's like these are the parts of a building, because it's actually surprisingly difficult to get that visual training, like, you know, to look at a building. It's like, what is this? What is this? What is this? And so I've used it as kind of like teaching opportunities as well, you know. And so I think there's a component of that as well, that I think that doing like comparative photography, you know, showing how places change over time. I'm a big fan of Stuart Brand's book, you know, How Buildings Learn, you know, because so much of this is about how buildings have changed over time. But I'm really kind of I'm at a total bit of a flummoxed crossroads, because I'm like, what do I do with all of this?
You know there's something there.
Right. I just don't know what it is quite yet.